With me now, Brian Trascher, who was a leading member of the Donald Trump campaign here in Louisiana, and I'm also joined by Dr Calvin Mackie, a lifelong resident of New Orleans, who led efforts to rebuild the city after Hurricane Katrina. He featured prominently in Spike Lee's documentary about the disaster. He also works closely with the African-American community. Calvin, what's your response to what that film was all about, which was really the question of how African Americans have fared in the last 8 years?
Well, the Spike Lee documentary really gave African Americans the opportunity to speak their voice about the tragedy that happened. The last 8 years have been the best of times and the worst of times. We thought things would be much better, but it seemed like a lot of the planning and work have been done on us instead of with us. So many African Americans feel that the city has been rebuilt to serve others than serve the citizens who make the city what it is.
You do feel, Brian, that this campaign is a pretty big contrast to Obama's campaigns of the past.
Yeah, I mean, you know, President Obama was a masterful campaigner. I think that he probably could have done better in the execution on following through of his promises and hope and change. We now, 8 years later, find a nation even more divided with even probably more racial tension.
Very
than when he took
frustrated
over.
by a Republican Congress.
Yeah, but the first 2 years of his presidency, he had an unabashed Congress that would do whatever he wanted, and then he had a Senate that would do whatever he wanted for his first 6 years. So it wasn't completely an obstructionist Republican Congress, as some would say.
And now in New Orleans, I mean, a lot of the African Americans have bled away. I mean, they were flooded out and they never came back.
Well, one story that was never told was that if I was, let's say, a middle-class African American with a degree, if I was a dentist, if I was a doctor, if I was an accountant, and I was serving the African American community, and you wake up one morning and your entire community is gone, what do you do? The story that hasn't been told is that many of the middle-class black African Americans left and established their lives in other places.
And what do you make now of this election?
Napoleon said a leader is a deal in hope. And somehow we have someone running for office who otherwise is appealing to the worst of what we are and what we can be. And that is very distressing in 2016.
This has been a troubling campaign. I mean, the abuse between the two candidates, both of them are guilty of abusing each other. But one also senses there have been terrible racial tensions raised by Mr. Trump's campaign.
I think that he's been given that moniker by the media, but I've yet to meet anybody who can point to a single example where he's said anything that was racially insensitive. And when he talks about immigration, he's talking about pro-legal immigration against illegal
ghettos
immigration.
From hell, he's talked about. Ghettos from hell, he's talked about.
Well, he's
building walls
talking about the
against
failing
Mexicans.
Infrastructure,
He's talked about banning Muslims. You know, I mean, you know, you go for it. It's all there.
Well, you know, when we're talking about bringing in Muslims without doing any kind of background checks, when they have declared war on us and they plan to attack us in our own communities, like we've seen on military bases and shopping malls, movie theaters, they've done it. So I think he's right to want to screen them.
Donald Trump that's talked about his African Americans. He's talked about African Americans walking down the street and getting shot. I mean, he's appealing to, Donald Trump appeals to the worst in everyone. And the demographics that he's appealing to, he's not holding them responsible for the situation that they're in. So he's trying to give them a way out for the situation that they're in by blaming others.
But in fairness, Mrs. Clinton hasn't either really galvanized the African American community with any much hope.
No, but she's not that type of candidate. She isn't galvanizing on any given day. On her best day, she's not the type of motivational type person. But what she has not done is attack people and attack people, their lifestyles, attack people where they live. She's not talked about locking people out. She's not,
Well, I mean, people are very frightened about what might happen after this election, even if Mr. Trump loses or wins.
Yeah, I mean, if he loses, then you're going to have a sitting president, presumably a President Clinton, who's going to be under federal investigation and more than likely indicted. If there's a Mr. Trump or President Trump, then you will definitely see an indicted and prosecuted Hillary Clinton for the crime she's committed that we're now seeing evidence of with these WikiLeaks
It's more the
dumps.
question of what Mr. Trump will do to the community.
Isn't it funny we now live in a country where people don't get what they weigh, then it's wrong? I thought we were a community of laws and law and order. This woman has been investigated for 30 years and never found guilty of anything, but yet and still we have politicians and lawyers say you are guilty, and if I'm elected like we're some third world country with a dictator. I'm gonna make sure that you go to jail. That is absolutely frightening.